So I'm curious though, how did you land? I know you slowly transition into real estate, but how did you land on this midterm rental strategy?
So at the time, I owned two properties, a single family and a duplex, both of which I house hacked because, as I've already told you, I wasn't making a lot of money. And so I used the house hacking strategy. So that allows you to put 3 or 3.5% down. So my very first two properties, I was all in like $7 or $8,000 per property. So at this point in the story, I've invested maybe $16,000 in down payments. And then I knew that I wanted to go bigger. David Green from Bigger Pockets calls it the stack. So you buy a single family and then a duplex and then maybe a triplex or a fourplex. So I knew I was due for like a fourplex. And I liked how the numbers looked when I bought something like that. And I knew I wanted to quit my job. So I thought, okay, I better use the owner occupied loan one more time before I
Mm,
become unqualified, like I'm not very lendable. And I bought a fourplex. And in doing so, I, of course, furnished my unit because I lived in it. And in my head, I thought, oh, I'll just rent it out on the weekends and I'll go stay at grandma and grandpa's. I specifically bought it for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons was it was about an hour away from my grandparents.
mm,
And that very first booking was an intern who wanted to book it all summer.
mm.
And I had heard of travel nurses. Surprisingly, as a traveler, like as an avid backpacker, I've met travel nurses all over the world, not normally when they're working at hospitals, but what they do is they take a 3-month contract, they stack their cash, and then they take 3 months off and go backpacking. So I
Mm.
had met travel nurses in Minca, Colombia, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And so I was actually really familiar with that line of work, just not related to real estate.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So grandpa and grandma were like shocked now that you're staying with them for 3 months instead of the weekend.
I mean, I'm their favorite grandchild. And
Oh, okay.
so they were, and I spent, like you, I had spent years living abroad. And
Yeah.
so they were so excited to have me.
That's awesome.
Admittedly, I think I bought a plane ticket to Mexico like the next week and spent 3 months in Mexico.
Nice. So that's cool. So you had that one then. That was your personal one. And then the other three, were you doing long term on those?
Yep, those are long
Okay.
term and they still are long term.
Okay. Got it. Okay. So that was your first introduction into midterm. And then why is it that you decided to stay there instead of like transitioning back to your original thought process of short-term rentals?
So what had happened is I realized that I was able to get more rent in the winter months with the medium term rental strategy than I was with short term. And so here's what really happened is I moved into that unit upstairs. And in that very first month of owning it, my tenants below me left in the middle of the night.
Mm,
They weren't great tenants to begin with, as you can imagine, that just
yeah.
flee in the middle of the night. And I called a property manager. I self-managed that unit, but I called a property manager like in panic. Oh my gosh, what do I do? And she was like, just like send them this letter, do these certain things, and just turn around and get it rented. I was like, okay. And so I thought, well, wait a minute, why don't I furnish it and have that be my first, short-term rental? We have Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway shareholder event in May, just happened this weekend. We have the College World Series in Omaha every summer in June. I thought, great, it's going to be a great short term rental. And it was until the fall came. And then it's
Mm.
crickets. No one's going to Omaha on a Tuesday, right? And so what I did is I pivoted to longer term tenants, or now what I call medium term tenants, and realized that my net income was even higher than what it was with short term because it's less vacancy, it's a higher nightly rate, and then it's 2 to 2.5 times what I was getting from long term. So then I waited for my next tenant in the fourplex for their lease to come due, sent them a notice of non-renewal, and furnished that one as well. So now I have 3 furnished rentals and 1 long term in that fourplex. Within 45 days, I was under contract on the fourplex next door.
Ah,
So now I
nice.
own the fourplex next door and I turned all 4 of those into furnished rentals. So now I have 7 furnished rentals. Each of them are bringing in $1,875 as a medium term.
Wow.
My long-term tenant pays $800. So this is more than 2 times. And my PITI, my principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, my monthly payment on each building is $2,000 each.
Wow. So one unit almost gets you to break even, and then you got 3 more on top of that.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so the one long term, I'm curious if that's just like a holdout as your original your original tenant, or you just wanted to keep a long term.
It's funny. I've since bought more units, and the units that I'm buying now are typically side by side duplexes. And I am typically keeping one as a long term, one side long term, one side medium term. What I'm finding, and I'm sure you experience this, the furnished rentals, they're not passive. They take a lot of time. It's great when the systems work and there's a check-in that you don't hear anything and it's automated and everything's great. And you have check-ins that aren't great. And there's some back and forth that needs to happen, whether it be with the cleaner or the handyman or the guests themselves. And so I just started to fall in love with this model of having one long-term and one medium-term. Usually the long-term tenant, their rent almost covers the mortgage completely, almost. And then the medium-term tenant is just like almost pure cash flow. And I like that balance because if the tenant doesn't book through Airbnb, then I'm finding them through Furnish Finder, and that takes time. There is administrative work that goes into securing the medium-term tenant.
Got it. Okay. That's what I was going to ask you about, is where most of them come from. So it is Furnish Finders typically.
Yeah, it used to be in 2022, it was 70% Furnish Finder, 30% through Airbnb, where my tenants were finding me. Now I'm 50-50, 50% through Airbnb and 50% through Furnish Finder.
Okay.
Airbnb is doing a really big push for these longer term stays. 1 in every 4 guests that books through Airbnb is now booking for 28 days or more.
Wow. And is that your minimum that you set on the platform?
I do.
Okay.
Yes.
Nice. Yeah, I think there's a nuance that for people listening to this, if you're new getting into this, that I think you might not have picked up on, but it's this small multifamily strategy, how impactful that is to the bottom line. And I try to push this with my group as much as possible. Everyone, I feel like a broken record all the time, but when you have multiple streams of income, and especially in these more affordable areas, because I'm in Indiana, similar type of markets, I think, to Omaha. And, like that 4 unit, a lot of people would go out and just be tempted to buy a single family house. And that's their idea of a furnished property. But when you've got a 4 unit as a midterm or short-term rental, it is the cash flow is incredible. Even if it's slightly lower nightly rate or slightly lower occupancy, you've got 4 streams and one fixed set of expenses. So I don't want that to be lost on people who are listening, because if you start there, I think you'll be shocked at how nice the cash flow looks compared to single families in a lot of cases.
Well, and I'm so glad you brought up occupancy. So in 2 of my 7 units in Omaha, 100% occupied.
Wow.
Those nurses, they happen to be travel nurses or travel medical professionals. They extended from 3 months to 6 months. So now I have 6 months of 100% occupancy. And then I was able to do a same day turnover. So it was occupied for the whole year. So 100%. So again, remember guys, I was a journalist, so I love manipulating numbers. So, so in full transparency, let's take those 2 out of the equation and now just look at the remaining 5 that were not 100%. That way the 100% doesn't affect this average, right guys?
Yeah.
Following me with math. So these 5 other units that were not 100% occupied, they were 97% occupied.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, so huge advantage over short-term rentals, where 70% is typically considered really great for a short-term rental. So even though the nightly rate might be a little bit higher with short-term rentals, you got that occupancy to factor in, and it's not always a sure thing. So So you mentioned where you advertise on Furnish Finders. Um, how do you finance these deals? Is it different than short-term rent? Is it easier than short-term rentals because you have a contract in place, or is it similar? Or
It's interesting. I think that it really depends on the lender. So if you're doing a DSCR loan, I think those lenders really look at them the same way as a short-term rental. If you are going conventional and you need the rental income to qualify for the property, we are running into somewhat of an issue where most conventional lenders are going to look at 75% of market long-term rent. I've been having a hard time finding a conventional lender that will consider the medium term rent unless you have a lease, which it's a little difficult to lease out while you're under contract, especially if it's not furnished.
yeah,
And so I'm finding that lenders are looking at 75% of the long term rent, which in some markets is fine. Like my Omaha property would qualify, no problem. But as you start looking at more expensive markets, that does become an issue. And that's where the DSCR loan is so great.
got it. Okay. Yep. Yeah, most of my lenders want to see that backup option as a long-term rental as well. And I sleep better at night knowing that's always an option if I had to switch back to that. So,
And I think that's what it is. I think that I make it sound like the only reason that I do the long term, medium term inside of a duplex is just because of time. It's also peace of mind. Like I know that at the end of the day, if something changes with the hospital nearby or regulations in the town, I know that a long term rental will suffice. Are the cash flow numbers as enticing? No, but it's still a great investment.
absolutely. Yeah. And do you see any potential of saturation with, there's only so many, traveling nurses, and I'm sure you get this question all the time. How do you judge that?
Yeah, I do. I think that as municipalities really crack down on short-term rentals, we're going to see a lot of these short-term rentals turn into medium-term rentals, and it's going to be an issue. And so I think it's really important that you are running your numbers really conservatively and you're running a business. This is a furnished rental business. So all of the little touches when it comes to decor, amenities, their check-in experience, all of that needs to be paid attention to. We have a lot of short-term rental operators who got really spoiled during 2020 and 2021 and even last year in 2022 where you could just throw up a listing on Airbnb and make some good money. I think
Hmm.
those days are behind us. I think you need to be better than the competition. And so what we say at Aria Design is we're not going to be 100% better than all of your competition because you don't need to be 100% better. What's great about the medium term rental strategy, you need 4 guests a year, just
Yeah.
4. So why don't we be 10, maybe 20% better than your competition? So that's beautifully decorated, amenities that they care about, in a location that's convenient. Think about the experience that you're giving. And please, please, please have professional photos and a great guest experience. And I almost guarantee that you're going to be able to get 4 guests a year.